Ethan Cole had less than 3 seconds to understand that everything had gone wrong. The warning klaxons in his cockpit screamed over the shrill whine of the emergency systems. Every red light on the console pulsing like a heartbeat. A meteor. Fragment, no bigger than a suitcase, but fast enough to shear through alloy, had punched a ragged hole in the starboard side of his small survey ship. Pressure alarms wailed. Smoke poured from a ruptured panel, burning his eyes and clawing at his throat. The ship's hull shuddered as it hit the upper layers of atmosphere, the sound a deep, groaning protest. Ethan's breath came fast and shallow as he yanked the oxygen mask from its clip, fastening it over his face with trembling hands. The viewport was fractured but intact, giving him brief, jagged glimpses of the world below, a vast expanse of alien forest unfurling like a living tapestry, spiraling trees with metallic gold bark, and crowns of crimson foliage that shimmered under the light of not one but 2 suns. The larger star was red and heavy in the sky, the smaller a pale, watchful companion. For a heartbeat he forgot the pain in his leg, forgot the smell of burning insulation. This world was beautiful and utterly unknown. The port stabilizer failed with a shriek of metal, sending the ship into a stomach-churning spiral. Gravity clawed at him. His vision tunneled. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew this was it. Either he found a way down in one piece, or he'd be scattered across 1,000 kilometers of alien canopy. He fought the controls until the hull screamed. Ben braced for impact. When the world stopped moving, there was only silence, broken by the soft hiss of escaping vapor. Ethan's head throbbed. His leg burned. He blinked against the dim, gold-tinted light filtering through the cracked viewport. His ship, once sleek and angular, was now a crumpled shell half buried in the earth. Smoke curled lazily upward, vanishing into the alien sky. Gritting his teeth, he dragged himself from the seat, pain lancing up his thigh. The gash was bad, but not fatal. He limped to the storage panel, retrieving a basic medkit, the battered portable translator, and his survival knife. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He patched the wound with antiseptic and a pressure band, hissing at the sting, and forced himself to stand. The forest loomed around him in impossible detail trunks, twisting in elegant spirals, leaves glimmering like wet silver in the soft breeze. Somewhere above, bird-like shapes flitted from branch to branch, their wings glowing faintly. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and a strange sweetness he couldn't place. Then he heard it soft at first, almost lost in the whisper of leaves. Footsteps. More than one set. He turned toward the sound, knife loose in his hand. Figures emerged between the trees, their shapes tall and lithe, moving with a grace that made no sound at all. The light caught on their skin, which shimmered faintly like polished stone. Eyes large and unblinking reflected the glow of the forest liquid mercury in the gathering dusk. All women. All armed. Spears of some translucent, glowing material caught the sun's last light. They fanned out as they approached, flanking him with silent precision. Ethan's mind cataloged their movements automatically, the spacing between them, the coordinated way they tightened the circle, the practiced discipline of hunters who knew their territory. One stepped forward, taller than the rest, her bearing marked with authority. She spoke in a language he didn't understand, melodic yet edged with command. "I don't understand," Ethan said, keeping his voice low, his hands spread in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. Her gaze didn't soften. The circle tightened. The leader gestured sharply, pointing to the ground. The message was unmistakable. "Submit." Ethan hesitated, weighing his chances, then slowly knelt. The knife slid from his fingers to the mossy ground. 2 of the women moved in, binding his wrists with a fiber cord that pulsed faintly against his. Skin warm, alive, almost breathing. They had him. They moved like shadows, silent and sure-footed, guiding Ethan through the alien forest. His wrists throbbed where the living cord tightened with each movement, the faint pulse of it unnerving in a way metal cuffs never could be. The air was thick with the scent of strange blossoms, their petals faintly luminous in the dimming light. Overhead, the spiraling branches of the great trees tangled together, casting patterns of gold and silver across the path. The women didn't speak to him, but they spoke to each other short, quiet exchanges in that melodic tongue that seemed to rise and fall like a song half-remembered. Every so often, the tall one at the front, the leader, would glance over her shoulder, her expression unreadable in the shifting glow. Ethan met her gaze once, and for an instant, something passed between them. Not pity, not anger, but the measuring look of someone deciding whether you are a threat worth killing. The trail sloped upward, and the forest opened suddenly into a plateau, bathed in the soft radiance of the twin suns. Before them lay a village unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Structures spiraled upward from the ground as though grown, not built walls woven from vines that glowed faintly, their patterns intricate and deliberate. The buildings were not separate from the land, but part of it, their roots sunk deep into the soil, their upper reaches entwined with the branches of the living trees dot as they approached. The women standing guard at the village's edge called out in voices that were almost musical. Others gathered, emerging from doorways and shaded gardens. Ethan felt their eyes on him, curious, suspicious, assessing. All were women. Their skin shimmered like stone under moonlight, their eyes reflecting the glow of their surroundings. Some bore tattoos in curling patterns. Others wore ornaments, fashioned from crystal-like petals and translucent scales. The crowd parted as the leader led him toward the largest structure at the village's heart. Its walls were of stone, not vine, carved with intricate reliefs that seemed to move in the changing light. Ethan's gaze snagged on the image's tall figures, clearly female, standing alongside others that were unmistakably male, their features not unlike his own. Scenes of hunting, building, feasting together, followed abruptly by carvings of fire and ruin, of division, of the men's forms fading from the stone entirely. The leader gestured, and Ethan was pushed forward through an archway into a vast hall. The air inside was cool, scented faintly with resin and flowers. Elders sat in a semicircle, their tattoos elaborate and deep in hue, their posture regal. The leader spoke at length, her voice a flowing cadence that carried authority without needing volume. One of the elders, her eyes sharp and steady, rose and crossed the hall to Ethan. She knelt, her movements graceful, and placed a hand lightly on his chest. He felt the weight of her gaze as she spoke a single word, zones, repeating it as if tasting its meaning each time. The other elders exchanged glances, their expressions flickering between curiosity and caution. Another woman stepped forward, slender, with quiet eyes that seemed to take in everything. She touched the cord at his wrists, spoke a few words to the leader, and with a nod, it was loosened. Ethan rubbed at the marks the living fiber had left, his muscles tense, waiting for the next move. The quiet-eyed woman beckoned, gesturing for him to follow her deeper into the hall. The crowd outside murmured, and Ethan caught the edge of the sound, a note of awe, or perhaps apprehension. Whatever he was to them, Threlic, relic, omen, he was no longer just a lost traveler. Something about him had stirred memory, and that, he knew, was far more dangerous than the crash that had brought him here. Ethan woke to a soft, unfamiliar light filtering through the woven walls of the shelter they had given him. It wasn't much, just a corner space under a canopy of vine and leaf, the floor cushioned with a layer of moss-like growth, but it was warmer and drier than the forest floor. His leg ached from the crash, but the bandage had been changed while he slept. Someone had seen to him while he was unconscious, and that unsettled him more than it comforted him. Outside, the village moved with quiet purpose. The Zari women went about their morning tasks in a kind of unspoken harmony, weaving glowing vines into baskets, tending to gardens of plants whose roots swam in crystal pools, repairing walls that seemed to hum faintly in the light. No shouting, no chaos, just an efficiency that reminded Ethan of a well-rehearsed orchestra, each player knowing their place in the melody. When he stepped out, the nearest conversations faltered, heads turning toward him. Some faces held open. Curiosity, others a wariness that felt heavier than words. He raised a hand in what he hoped was a neutral greeting. No one returned it. The quiet-eyed woman from last night appeared, her gaze calm but searching. She carried a shallow bowl of something that looked like fruit smooth-skinned, iridescent, dotted with tiny seeds that glistened in the morning light. She extended it to him. "Thank you," Ethan murmured, though he knew she wouldn't understand. She responded with a nod and gestured for him to follow. She led him to a shaded clearing where several women sat in a semicircle, their hands working thin, luminous strands into a broad tapestry stretched between two carved poles. The patterns shimmered faintly, like moonlight on water, shifting as the strands tightened. Ethan stopped short, his curiosity overriding his caution. This was no simple craft. Every motion was deliberate, a design emerging in a rhythm he couldn't yet decipher. The woman pointed to herself. "Era?" Her voice was soft, the syllables rolling like water over stone. Then she pointed to him, waiting. "Ethan, he?" "Said, Avon," she repeated, her accent giving the name a musical lilt. The other women murmured to each other, some glancing his way without the sharpness he'd felt earlier. For the next hour, Era worked while teaching him words, pointing to objects, a woven basket, a pool of water, the twin suns overhead, speaking their names slowly until he repeated them correctly. He learned Trina for tree, Sil for water, Lura and Thou for the suns. The Zari language was layered, each word shaped by intonation that could twist meaning entirely. Still, the bridge it offered between them was worth the effort. Later, Era brought him to the gardens. Women harvested glowing roots with tools of bone and vine, drawing out a thick sap that hardened into a durable material in the air. Ethan watched, fascinated, already thinking about its possible uses for shelter reinforcement. It was Kira the tall, fierce warrior who broke the rhythm of the day. She appeared without warning, a spear in hand, her tattoos catching the sun in sharp geometric flashes. She said something short, clipped, and gestured for him to follow. Era gave him a slight nod, as though to say it was safe. Kira led him to the village's edge, where the forest pressed close and the air was cool with shade. She demonstrated her spearwork in fluid, precise arcs, each movement a blend of elegance and lethality. Then she thrust the weapon into his hands. Ethan tried to mimic her form, clumsy at first, but steadying with each pass. Her eyes narrowed, watching for weakness, for hesitation. He gave her neither. After several rounds, she reclaimed the spear, one corner of her mouth lifting in the faintest acknowledgement. For the first time since he had woken among them, Ethan felt the smallest crack in the wall between himself and the Zari. It was thin and fragile, but it was there, a thread in the tapestry Ara had begun that morning. That night, as the twin suns dipped and the village gathered to sing in harmonies that resonated through the glowing trees, Ethan sat near the edge of the firelight. The music was haunting, filled with a longing he couldn't place. Era sat beside him, gesturing toward the dancers and murmuring a single word, zones. He didn't know its meaning, but he knew it mattered. And from the way both Era and Kira glanced at him in the flickering light, he suspected it might matter more than he could yet understand. The first sign of trouble was the silence. It came mid-afternoon, just as Ethan was helping Era lift a bundle of glowing vine from the garden pools. The usual background sounds of the forest, the trill of the bird-like creatures, the hum of wind through spiral branches had faded, replaced by a faint pressure in the air that made the hair on his arms stand up. The light itself seemed to change, the twin suns blurring behind a wall of approaching cloud. He glanced upward. On the horizon, a storm front boiled, its clouds lit from within by jagged flashes of blue-green lightning. It moved fast, swallowing the warmth of the suns and leaving the world in an eerie, dim half-light. "Ethan." Ara's voice cut sharper than usual, beckoning him urgently toward the heart of the village. Around them, the Zari moved with sudden precision, tying vines to anchor walls, carrying baskets of luminous roots into fortified storage, reinforcing doorways with bundles of woven fiber. Their movements were too practiced to be panic. This was ritual, survival drilled into muscle memory. Ethan tried to help, grabbing a coil of vine from a passing woman, but the way she wove it into the structure's frame was a pattern he didn't recognize. The knots he tied were sloppy, coming loose almost as soon as the wind began to push against the walls. Kira appeared out of the chaos, a bundle of vines over her shoulder, her tattoos catching the flickers of lightning. Without a word, she shoved a smaller bundle into his arms and demonstrated quickly, her fingers looping and pulling until the vine locked into itself with a faint internal glow. "Like this," she said, the words clipped but clear. Ethan nodded and mirrored her movements. His knots weren't as elegant, but they held. He moved to another wall, securing it against the rising wind, his muscles burning with the effort. The first fat drops of rain fell, hissing where they struck the sun-warmed earth. Then the storm arrived in full wind, howling through the village. Like a living thing, tearing leaves from branches, rattling the vine walls. The glowing trees at the perimeter swayed dangerously, their spiral trunks creaking. Ethan worked alongside Kira and Ara to anchor the largest structure in the village, shelter for the youngest and oldest among them. The vines writhed in their hands, alive and eager to bind, pulling tight against the stakes driven deep into the soil. A deafening crack split the air. Ethan spun in time to see one of the massive bioluminescent trees at the edge of the village give way, its trunk splintering under the wind's assault. It tilted toward a cluster of homes. "Run!" Kira shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him back just as the tree crashed to the ground, its branches lighting the sky in a wash of pale gold before scattering across the muddy earth. The homes beneath it crumpled, but the occupants thankfully had already fled. "We can't leave it like that," Ethan gasped, rain plastering his hair to his head. "If the wind shifts, it'll crush more." Kira's jaw tightened, but she gave a short nod. Together they waded into the debris, hacking at the thick, glowing branches with cutting tools. The wood was fibrous and resistant, the scent of it sharp and sweet as it split. The rain turned to sheets, stinging his face, soaking him to the bone. Twice he slipped in the mud, catching himself only because Kira's grip on his arm was like iron. His hands blistered, his back screamed, but the work didn't stop until they'd cleared enough of the fallen tree to keep it from causing more damage. By the time they staggered back to the shelter, the storm had begun to ebb, the wind dropping to a restless whisper. Kira dropped the last length of vine from her shoulder, her chest heaving. She gave Ethan a look, half challenge, half something warmer, and clapped his shoulder. "Not useless," she said simply, before walking away into the rain. When dawn came, the village was battered, but whole. Several homes were gone, the gardens damaged, but no lives had been lost. As the Zari gathered in the central clearing, Sharai, the matriarch, moved to stand before Ethan. Her expression was still iron, but there was no mistaking the shift in her voice when she said, in halting English, "You help." Ethan felt something unclench in his chest. Whatever he was here, however they still doubted him, he had earned a place in their survival story. And in a place like this, that meant more than any words could. The storm had barely left the horizon when Shirai summoned. Ethan, Kira, and Era were already waiting at the base of the massive stone hall he'd only seen from the outside until now. Its carved walls gleamed faintly in the softened morning light, water still dripping from the eaves where vine and stone met in seamless union. The carvings were more intricate up close, their lines cut so fine they seemed to breathe when the light shifted. Shirai stood at the threshold, her staff tipped with the same luminous material as the Zari spears. She didn't speak to him at first, just studied him, her gaze measuring and relentless before gesturing for him to follow. Inside, the air was cool and still, the sound of the village muffled as though they had stepped into another world. High stone columns supported a vaulted ceiling that caught and reflected the hall's faint glow. Along every wall, the carvings stretched in long panels, each one a story frozen in stone. Ethan slowed as he passed them. At first, the images showed scenes of cooperation Zari women and men, the men's features surprisingly human, working together to build spiraling homes, hunt the vast, scaled beasts carved in loving detail, gather glowing fruits from tall groves. The artistry was so fine that he could almost see the movement in their poses, the easy unity between them. But the next panel darkened. Lines became jagged, chaotic. The men and women stood apart, their faces contorted in anger. Flames tore through their shared works. Trees burned, and the spiraling homes cracked under some unseen force. In the final panel, the men faded like mist, their forms ghostly and incomplete. The women left alone in a landscape of ruin. Ethan's throat tightened. What happened to them? He murmured. Era, walking at his side, hesitated before speaking in halting English. Stories are old. Some say sickness, some war. But they left or were lost. Shirai halted before a central platform of black obsidian, polished to a mirror's shine. She placed her staff against it, and the carvings around them seemed to glow faintly, their lines pulsing as if stirred by her touch. Then she spoke, her words low but carrying through the chamber. Ethan caught one repeated term, zones, and glanced at Era. Zones means connection, she whispered. Balance. Between us, between past and now. Ethan frowned, looking back to the panels. The word fit each scene, had been a picture of either harmony or fracture. The balance had been broken. Once before. His presence here, a man among them for the first time in generations, could be seen as the return of that balance, or the beginning of its undoing. Shirai stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. First, man, she said in careful English. Many years. You are here. This matters. He felt the weight of her words like a stone pressing on his chest. He wasn't just a castaway anymore. To them, he was a living echo of something long gone, something powerful enough to change the shape of their world. What do you expect me to do? He asked, his voice low. Shirai didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked to Era, who laid a gentle hand on his arm. You must choose. Stay and be part, or leave. But before choice, a test, the trial of convergence. The way she said, it made the hairs on his neck rise. It didn't sound like a trial of skill or strength alone. It sounded like something older, heavier, and final dot as they left the hall. Ethan cast one last glance at the fading figures in the last carving. The empty space where the men had been seemed to watch him as much as he watched it, as though waiting to see if history would repeat itself. The trial of convergence began at dusk. The whole village gathered in a wide clearing just beyond the central hall, their faces lit by the soft glow of stones embedded in the ground. These weren't random markers. Their placement formed a perfect circle, each stone carved with spiraling symbols that seemed to shift subtly When he looked too long, Kira stood near the edge, arms folded, her tattoos catching the low light in sharp lines. Era lingered closer, her expression calm but watchful. Shirai entered last, her staff in hand, the tip casting a pale beam over the gathered faces. She spoke, her voice carrying with ritual weight, and Ethan caught his own name among the flowing syllables. Era leaned in to translate, her voice low. 3 challenges: body, mind, spirit. You pass, you belong. You fail, you leave. The first test began without warning. 2 women stepped forward, setting a smooth, rune-marked stone in front of him. Easily 50 pounds, maybe more. Shirai gestured toward the far edge of the forest, her meaning clear. Ethan crouched, gripping the cool surface. The weight settled into his muscles like an unwelcome guest. He took the first step, then another, uneven ground forcing him to adjust constantly. The circle of Zari followed at a distance, silent. Sweat slicked his palms, his injured leg burning, but he refused to slow. Somewhere in his mind, he heard Kira's voice from the storm, not useless. When he reached the finish, his legs trembled. Under the strain, he set the stone down with more reverence than he expected, breathing hard but unbroken. The faintest ripple of approval moved through the onlookers. The second test came as the light began to fade. A Zari woman stepped forward with a broken tool, one of the curved harvest implements used to draw sap from the glowing roots. She placed it at his feet, then handed him a bundle of raw materials: vine, hardened sap, a fragment of bone. No instructions. Ethan knelt, turning the tool in his hands. He remembered watching the women in the gardens, the way they'd bound the vines to reinforce the curve, how the sap hardened in air. Working carefully, he spliced the break, lacing vine through bone until the frame was whole. When he coated the join with sap, it began to glow faintly as it cured. He held it up. The murmurs this time were louder, and one of the elders gave a short, approving nod. The third test was the one that unnerved him. As full dark settled over the forest, Era led him into the sacred grove, a place he'd never been allowed to enter. The air here was thicker, charged with an energy that prickled against his skin. The trees glowed brighter, their light pulsing, in a rhythm that seemed almost like breath. You stay, Era said softly, alone, until dawn. Think, choose. Then she was gone, leaving him in the quiet hum of the grove. At first, he walked the perimeter, tracing the ancient carvings in the stones, spirals, suns, figures with arms outstretched. But the stillness pressed in, and soon the visions began. Memories of Earth, of the black between stars, of the crash. Faces of Zari women he now knew, their expressions shifting hope, fear, accusation. When the sky began to pale, he understood his answer had been waiting in him. Since the storm, he stepped out of the grove as the first light touched the village. The Zari waited in the clearing, eyes fixed on him. Shirai stood at the center, staff in hand. Ethan met her gaze and spoke in their language, clumsy but clear. Here, with you. For a heartbeat, the clearing was still. Then a wave of sound rose, their song swelling into the air, harmonies weaving through the morning light. Kira's hand clasped his shoulder, firm and steady. Era's smile was small but filled with pride. Shirai stepped forward, her palm pressing against his chest. Zones, she said simply. It wasn't just acceptance. It was a binding. From that morning on, Ethan Cole was no longer the outsider who had fallen from the sky. The days that followed felt different, threaded with a quiet recognition from the Zari women that hadn't been there before. Where there had once been wary glances, now there were nods in greeting. Where work had been done around him, now he was invited into its rhythm. He spent mornings with Era, tending the gardens and learning the subtle ways the glowing roots and vines responded to care. She showed him how to listen for the hum in there, fibers before cutting, how to store the sap so it kept its strength. Afternoons were often with Kira hunting in the deeper forest, tracking the four-legged creatures whose hides could be woven into shelter walls. Their exchanges were few words, but their silences had shifted. She no longer measured him for weakness with every look. And in the evenings, when the village gathered to sing beneath the twin moons, Ethan sang with them awkwardly, off-tempo. But welcome Dot, it was during one of these evenings that Era approached him with a quiet urgency. She gestured for him to follow, slipping away from the circle of firelight. They moved through the forest until the ground began to slope upward. At the crest, nestled between twisted golden trunks, stood a structure half swallowed by roots and time. The stonework was older than anything in the village, its carvings weathered, yet still telling a story. This. Before, Hera said softly, brushing moss from a panel. Ethan crouched, brushing away more debris. The carving showed the Zari men. And women together, not in the village, but in a place that looked like the forest they now stood in, yet different. Above them, a great vessel rose into the sky, its shape distinctly un-Zari. At its head was a man. And Ethan froze. The carving was crude, stylized, but the resemblance was unmistakable. His jawline, the set of his shoulders, even the same streak in his hair. It was him, or someone who looked exactly like him. He leaned closer, heart pounding. The next panel showed the men boarding the vessel, the women watching from below. Then, the ship gone, the women alone once more. Era watched him, her silver-flecked eyes steady. You see. I see, he murmured, his voice low. But he didn't understand, not fully. Was this a warning? A prophecy? A cycle that had happened before and was now beginning again? The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of the village's song. For a moment, the forest around them seemed to hold its breath. Ethan stepped back from the carving, his mind a tangle of questions he couldn't yet shape into words. The Zari believed he was a link to their past. But what if he was more than that? What if he had been here before? Or would be here again? When they returned to the village, Sharai met his eyes across the firelight. She didn't speak, but the weight of her gaze told him she already knew what he had seen. That night, lying in his shelter with the moss floor warm beneath him, and the song still echoing in his ears, Ethan understood something dangerous and exhilarating. His story here was not the first chapter. It was only the next. And the past he didn't remember might be the key to the future they would build together, or the reason it would all burn again.